Chris Martin sat behind his executive desk at Martin Construction, reviewing the quarterly reports with intense focus. His company's latest project, a 30-story commercial complex in downtown Glendale, would cement his legacy as Washington's premier developer. 20 years of strategic decisions, calculated risks, and unwavering determination had built his empire. At 45, he commanded respect in every room he entered. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Martin, your daughter Emily is here to see you." "Send her in," Chris replied, his stern expression softening slightly. Emily burst through the door, her college backpack slung over one shoulder. At 19, she carried herself with the same confidence as her father, though her artistic nature, inherited from her mother, showed in her carefully curated outfit and the sketchbook she always carried. "Dad, you won't believe what happened in my business class today," she began, dropping into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Professor Martinez used Martin Construction as a case study. The whole class turned to look at me when he mentioned your name. Chris allowed himself a small smile. "And what did Professor Martinez have to say about us?" "He called you ruthlessly efficient and unnervingly precise in your business strategies." Emily pulled out her notebook. "He talked about how you outmaneuvered Carter Development in 2018 to secure the waterway project. Carter made the mistake of thinking friendship meant I wouldn't compete aggressively," Chris said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "In business, there's no room for sentiment." Emily studied her father's expression. "Mom says you used to be different. More relaxed." Chris's jaw tightened. "Your mother remembers what she wants to remember. Speaking of which, how is she doing with her teaching?" "She loves it at Mason Community College. Actually, she's been staying late for faculty meetings lately. Says she's finally finding her creative spark again." Chris nodded, though something in his daughter's words nagged at him. Sophia had been different lately. Distracted, checking her phone more often, humming to herself like she used to when they first met. He'd attributed it to her renewed passion for art, but 23 years of marriage had taught him to recognize subtle shifts. "Dad," Emily's voice pulled him back. "Will you be home for dinner tonight? Mom's making your favorite, beef bourguignon." "I have a business dinner with the zoning board," he replied. "Tell your mother not to wait up." After Emily left, Chris opened his laptop and pulled up his calendar. The business dinner was a lie. He'd finished negotiations with the zoning board last week. Tonight, he would drive home unannounced and observe his wife's late-night activities himself. Across town at Mason Community College, Sophia Martin stood before her easel in the art studio, adding final touches to her latest painting. At 43, she retained the beauty that had first caught Chris's attention, though years of suppressing her artistic dreams had left invisible scars. "That's remarkable work." Daniel Carter's voice came from behind her. "Your use of light and shadow captures such raw emotion." Sophia turned to face the literature professor, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Daniel, I didn't hear you come in." "I couldn't stay away," he said, moving closer to examine the painting. "Your talent deserves a wider audience than just your students." Chris says the same thing, though he's usually too busy to look at my work anymore. Sophia set down her brush, aware of how close Daniel stood. "Your husband builds physical structures," Daniel said softly. "But you, Sophia, you build worlds with your brush. There's magic in what you do." Their eyes met, and Sophia felt the familiar flutter in her stomach. Over the past few months, Daniel had become more than just a colleague. Their conversations about art and literature had awakened something she thought long buried under years of comfortable suburban existence. "We should get coffee," Daniel suggested, his hand brushing against hers as he reached for one of her sketches. "That new place downtown just opened. I'd love to hear more about your influences." Sophia glanced at her phone. No messages from Chris. "I'd like that." At home that evening, Emily sat in her room, trying to focus on her economics textbook, but distracted by the sounds of her mother preparing to go out. She heard the shower running, then the click of heels on the hallway floor, followed by the subtle scent of perfume, the expensive kind her father had given Sophia for their anniversary, which she rarely wore anymore. Emily's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Having coffee with colleagues. Don't wait up. Love you." She frowned at the message. Her mother had been having a lot of coffee with colleagues lately. Part of her wanted to question it, but another part, the part that remembered her mother's tears during countless lonely dinners while Chris worked late, wanted to believe Sophia was simply reclaiming her identity. The sun had set by the time Chris's Mercedes pulled into their driveway. The house was quiet, but Sophia's car was gone. He checked his security app. She had left 45 minutes ago. Removing his shoes, he moved silently through their home. Noting details with the same precision, he applied to building inspections. Sophia's art studio, converted from their formal dining room years ago, drew his attention. The space smelled of oil paints and turpentine, but underneath lay a hint of unfamiliar cologne. Chris approached her easel, where a fresh painting dried. The subject made his blood run cold. A man's hand reaching toward a woman's silhouette, their fingers almost touching, the space between them charged with unspoken desire. He found her sketchbook next, filled with recent drawings. Page after page revealed intimate studies of a man's face. Strong jaw, intense eyes, thoughtful mouth. The man appeared repeatedly in various poses and expressions, each sketch dated within the last 3 months. The final drawing showed the same man in profile, and beneath it, Sophia had written a single word: Daniel. Chris's phone vibrated. A text from his private investigator, who he'd hired the moment Emily mentioned the late faculty meetings. A photo appeared on his screen. Sophia and a man entering Café Nouveau, their hands clasped, her head thrown back in laughter. The man matched the sketches perfectly. A second text followed with the man's identity: Professor Daniel Carter, Literature Department, Mason Community College. Divorced twice. Multiple complaints from former colleagues about inappropriate relationships. A gambling problem carefully hidden behind academic credentials. Chris closed the sketchbook and returned it exactly as he'd found it. He took photos of the paintings and sketches with his phone, his movements precise and controlled. Then he sat in the darkness of the studio, surrounded by evidence of his wife's betrayal, and began to plan. When Sophia returned home 3 hours later, the house was empty and dark. She hummed softly as she removed her jewelry, her lips still tingling from Daniel's goodnight kiss. In her purse, a gallery business card carried his handwritten note: "Your talent deserves to be seen. Let me help you shine." She didn't notice the silent figure watching from the shadows of her studio, didn't see the cold fury in her husband's eyes as she touched her lips and smiled at her reflection. She was too lost in the intoxicating feeling of being desired, appreciated, understood. Everything she thought she'd lost in her years as Mrs. Christopher Martin. That night, Chris lay awake beside his sleeping wife, his mind calculating moves and countermoves like the master strategist he was. Sophia had made a fatal mistake in betraying him. Soon, she would learn what everyone in the business world already knew. Christopher Martin didn't forgive betrayal, and his revenge was always absolute. Professor Daniel Carter's office at Mason Community College reflected his carefully cultivated image. Literary classics lined the shelves, framed poetry broadsides adorned the walls, and an antique desk held stacks of student papers waiting to be graded. But hidden behind this scholarly facade lay a predator's calculating mind. Daniel reviewed his bank statement with growing anxiety. The numbers glared back at him. Thousands lost at underground poker games, credit card debt mounting. His salary barely covered his alimony payments to 2 ex-wives, let alone his gambling habits. But Sophia Martin represented a potential solution to all his problems. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, quickly switching screens to a student's essay. Sophia entered, wearing a cream-colored blouse that complemented her dark hair. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Never," Daniel replied, rising to greet her. You're a welcome distraction from freshman compositions about the symbolic meaning of Gatsby's green light. She laughed, settling into the chair across from him. I brought you something. From her bag, she produced a small wrapped package. Daniel opened it to find a leather-bound collection of Pablo Neruda's love poems. Sophia, this is exquisite. Open it, she urged softly. Inside, she had sketched his portrait on the title page, surrounded by lines from If You Forget Me in her elegant handwriting. Below the drawing, she'd written, For the man who reminded me that passion still exists. Daniel reached across the desk and took her hand. You're extraordinary, you know that. That businessman husband of yours doesn't deserve your talent, your soul. Chris is complicated, Sophia said, but didn't pull her hand away. He provided everything I thought I wanted. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. Then let me help you find yourself again. Daniel moved around the desk, pulling her to her feet. Washington has no-fault divorce laws. With his wealth, the settlement would set you up for life. We could open that gallery you've dreamed about, combine art and literature in a space that celebrates creativity. Sophia's heart raced at his closeness, at the possibilities he described. Chris wouldn't let me go easily. You don't know him like I do. He destroys anyone who crosses him. Let me worry about Christopher Martin, Daniel murmured, drawing her closer. I've dealt with controlling husbands before. They're all the same, so focused on their money and power that they never see the knife coming until it's too late. What neither of them noticed was the small device attached beneath Daniel's desk, a premium-grade bug planted by Mark Reynolds, the private investigator Chris had hired. In his hotel room across town, Chris listened to their conversation through high-quality headphones, his expression unchanging as his wife melted into another man's arms. Reynolds, a retired detective with 30 years of experience, watched his client carefully. Want me to dig deeper into Carter's background? Reynolds asked. Chris nodded, removing the headphones. Everything. His finances, his previous marriages, his gambling habits. I want to know every skeleton in his closet, every weakness we can exploit. Already found something interesting, Reynolds said, opening a file on his laptop. 3 years ago, Carter had an affair with a married professor at Glendale University. When her husband discovered it, Carter convinced her to liquidate their joint accounts and run away with him. 2 months later, he disappeared with the money, leaving her bankrupt and humiliated. Is she willing to talk? Better. Reynolds smiled grimly. She kept emails, hotel receipts, bank statements, everything documenting his manipulation. And she's not the only one. I've identified 2 other women with similar stories at different colleges. Chris absorbed this information with cold satisfaction. Contact them all. Offer whatever compensation they need to share their stories. And Reynolds, make sure they understand that when the time comes, their testimony will destroy him. Meanwhile, Emily sat in her favorite campus coffee shop, trying to make sense of the changes in her family. Her mother's recent transformation bothered her, not the renewed interest in art, which Emily supported, but the secretive phone calls, the sudden attention to appearance, the late nights Sophia attributed to faculty meetings. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. Dinner tonight. Just us. Emily hesitated before replying. Her father rarely suggested one-on-one dinners, preferring family meals where he could observe and control the dynamic. Something must be wrong. That evening, at an upscale restaurant downtown, Chris studied his daughter across the table. She had Sophia's artistic sensitivity, but his own sharp intellect, a combination that made her particularly perceptive. How's Mom doing at the college? He asked casually. She seems happy, more energetic. She's even talking about submitting work to galleries again. Any particular reason for this sudden change? She mentions the other professors sometimes, especially this literature professor, Daniel Carter. He's been encouraging her to pursue her art seriously. Emily watched her father's reaction carefully. Dad, is everything okay between you and Mom? Chris's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried a subtle edge. Why do you ask? She's different lately, distracted. And you've been working later than usual. Emily set down her fork. If something's wrong, I want to know. I'm not a child anymore. No, you're not, Chris agreed. Which is why I need you to trust that I'm handling the situation. What situation? Emily pressed. Emily, Chris's tone carried a warning. Some things between your mother and me need to stay between us. Focus on your studies. Let me deal with any complications. Later that night, Chris met with Jonathan White, his corporate lawyer and closest friend, in the private room of an exclusive club. White reviewed the evidence Chris had gathered. Photos, recordings, financial records showing Sophia's use of joint accounts to fund Daniel's gambling. You've built a solid case, White said. But Chris, revenge won't heal the wound of betrayal. This isn't about healing, Chris replied, his voice cold. This is about justice. Sophia and her professor think they can take what's mine. Let them try. By the time I'm done, they'll wish they'd never met. White recognized the look in his friend's eyes, the same expression Chris wore before destroying business rivals. What's your play? First, we let them think they're winning. I'll appear distracted, workaholic, oblivious. Meanwhile, we'll move assets, create the illusion of business troubles. When Sophia files for divorce, she'll think she's striking at the perfect moment. And Carter. A cruel smile touched Chris's lips. He's a parasite who destroys women's lives for profit. By the time I'm finished, his reputation will be in ruins, his career over, and every penny Sophia gives him will disappear into a hole of his own making. The collateral damage, White began, is necessary. Chris cut him off. Sophia chose her path the moment she betrayed our marriage. Now she'll learn what it means to cross Christopher Martin. As they spoke, Sophia lay in Daniel's arms in his small apartment across town, believing she had found true love at last. She didn't know that every text, call, and secret meeting was being documented. She couldn't see the web of destruction her husband was weaving around her carefully constructed dream of freedom. In the darkness of his home office, Chris reviewed the day's surveillance photos. His finger traced Sophia's smiling face as she entered Daniel's apartment building. Soon, that smile would fade. Soon, she would understand the true cost of betrayal. And when she did, Christopher Martin would show no mercy. Professor Daniel Carter's office at Mason Community College reflected his carefully cultivated image. Literary classics lined the shelves, framed poetry broadsides adorned the walls, and an antique desk held piles of student papers waiting to be graded. But behind this scholarly facade lay a predator's calculating mind. Daniel reviewed his bank statement with growing anxiety. His debts to underground poker syndicates had ballooned again. The cafe gallery concept he pitched to Sophia was his best chance to climb out of the hole. But he needed more cash. Her settlement money would do nicely. Chris, back in his office, reviewed Mark Reynolds' latest intel. Daniel's lies grew bolder by the day, his gambling more desperate. Reynolds reported, Carter's in deep with some dangerous people. Underground poker, sports betting. He's hemorrhaging money. Perfect, Chris murmured, smiling. He'll cling to Sophia harder than ever. Make sure she keeps funneling funds to him. Meanwhile, Emily spent her days in a haze of confusion. She saw her mother's renewed creativity, but also the secrecy and tension growing between her parents. She wanted to warn Sophia about Daniel's reputation. She'd heard rumors from classmates, but fear held her back. One weekend, Chris arranged for Emily to spend time with him at the Martin construction headquarters. I want you to see the bigger picture, he told her. A real-life case study in business strategy. Emily listened intently as he explained corporate structures and asset management. What she didn't know was that her father's lesson was part of a carefully choreographed plan to ensure she trusted him when the final confrontation came. Sophia, unaware of Chris's machinations, poured herself into her new project with Daniel. The cafe gallery would combine art exhibitions with literary events, a cultural hub that Daniel insisted would rival anything Glendale had ever seen. She believed him because she needed to believe in something after the years of feeling invisible in her marriage. Daniel introduced her to wealthy investors, who were actually Chris's agents in disguise. They praised her talent, encouraging her to leave Chris and begin the divorce process. Believing she had real backers, Sophia filed the papers, certain she could force Chris into a quick settlement. She was confident her new allies would finance the cafe if needed. Chris pretended to be outraged, then appeared to concede when pressed. He offered Sophia a multi-million-dollar settlement, with suspiciously little fight. She took the money, thinking she and Daniel had won. Meanwhile, Chris funneled additional funds into shell companies that looked like hidden assets, guaranteeing Sophia would dig deeper, convinced she'd catch him in fraud. Daniel, feeling triumphant, gambled with even more reckless abandon, certain his new windfall would cover everything. Neither he nor Sophia realized Chris was pulling every string, orchestrating each setback, so they'd blame it on the misfortunes of a struggling Martin construction. Emily tried to maintain normalcy, focusing on her own classes and future. She'd gotten engaged to her longtime boyfriend, David Brown. Despite her excitement, tensions at home overshadowed her wedding plans. Sophia and Daniel insisted on helping with the wedding, funneling money into grand arrangements. Emily noticed the sudden extravagance: florists, caterers, decor beyond anything she and David had requested. "How can we afford all this?" she asked her mother one day. "Daniel has connections, special deals," Sophia replied with forced cheer. "Your father won't help, so let us do this for you." Emily felt uneasy, but she tried to be grateful. Over time, the wedding ballooned into a massive event at the Rosewood Hotel in Glendale, minus 500 guests. Lavish decor, an enormous budget. Daniel handled most of the payments, claiming he knew the vendors personally. Meanwhile, Chris silently matched each deposit through separate vendors, creating a parallel plan for the wedding in case everything collapsed. He refused to see his daughter's big day ruined by the lies fueling it. At the cafe gallery, Daniel's pressure mounted. Health inspectors, secretly connected to Chris, found minor but numerous violations. Suppliers had issues with deliveries, and negative reviews appeared online. The staff complained of missing wages. Sophia started to suspect something was very wrong. "Are you taking money from the business accounts?" she asked Daniel one night. He deflected, insisting he just needed more time for temporary cash flow issues. She believed him until the day she found him in a backroom poker game, her settlement money dwindling in front of him as he placed losing bets. Realizing she'd been conned, Sophia confronted Daniel. He turned on her in a rage, blaming her for everything, insisting she'd known what he was doing. In that moment, Mark Reynolds and the police burst into the game, arresting Daniel for fraud and assault. The entire takedown had been orchestrated by Chris, who arrived just in time to see his rival in handcuffs. Sophia stared at Chris in shock as Daniel was led away. "You did all this. You did it to yourself," Chris said coldly. "I only gave you a chance to show your true colors." Meanwhile, Emily prepared for her wedding day at the Rosewood Hotel, oblivious to the financial chaos. She believed her mother and Daniel had covered everything, not knowing the funds came from theft and gambling. Chris watched from a private suite with Jonathan White, monitoring the situation through hotel security feeds. At the last moment, vendors discovered their payments had bounced. Health inspectors appeared at the cafe gallery, shutting it down, followed by legal documents exposing Daniel's fraud. Everything erupted into scandal before Emily could even say "I do." Screens in the ballroom displayed evidence of Daniel's crimes, orchestrated by Chris to protect Emily from a doomed marriage. Emily, horrified, confronted Sophia. "Mom, did you know about all of this? You let him steal from my wedding fund." "I didn't know," Sophia wailed, but Emily could see the complicity. She realized her father had been right all along, that he'd orchestrated this terrible day to save her from a much greater disaster. Chris offered Emily a backup plan. Another venue, real payments, genuine contracts he'd secured months in advance. She could still have her wedding, but she'd have to accept the truth about her mother's betrayal. Grief-stricken, Emily left the hotel. The grand event collapsed, and the Rosewood staff cleared away the remnants of a celebration that had never begun. In the weeks that followed, charges mounted against Daniel. He fled the country, living on the run. Sophia found herself penniless, ostracized by friends who learned of her affair and involvement in Daniel's schemes. The cafe gallery was repossessed, quietly purchased by Martin Construction. Emily, disillusioned, postponed her wedding. She spent time with Chris, finally understanding the ruthless love that had driven him. He hadn't acted merely out of vengeance. He'd wanted to protect her. They rebuilt their relationship, forging a bond of honesty and respect. Months passed. Chris oversaw the complete transformation of the failed cafe gallery, turning it into a new community space called Chapter 1, a restaurant and cultural venue that Emily and David would run together. Smaller, more intimate, it opened without grand announcements, yet it soon became a beloved spot in Glendale. The negative history erased by genuine passion and transparent business practices. Sophia eventually left Washington for Meadowfield in Springdale, her reputation in ruins. She dedicated herself to teaching art therapy, working with trauma survivors. Perhaps she understood the need for healing on a deeper level than ever before. 5 years later, Christopher Martin stood in his office at Martin Tower, Glendale's newest architectural masterpiece. At 50, he remained formidable in business, but time and reflection had softened his edges. The company thrived in new ventures, including philanthropic work. Emily served as Chief Innovation Officer, guiding them toward sustainable projects. Chris's new wife, Andrea Lopes, one of Daniel's previous victims who'd found strength in truth, led a foundation helping survivors of financial abuse and deceit. Together, they ensured predators like Daniel could no longer prey on the vulnerable. From his office window, Chris watched the city lights. He thought of Emily, happily married to David after a smaller wedding that valued sincerity over spectacle. He thought of Sophia, rehabilitating herself through service to others. He thought of Daniel, forever on the run, haunted by his crimes. Revenge had been the catalyst, but in the end, truth had paved the way for healing and hope. Christopher Martin, once consumed by ruthless fury, discovered that real victory lay in protecting what mattered most and building a legacy of honesty. The betrayal he had once thought unforgivable became the foundation of a stronger future, one forged in hard-won truths rather than perfect lies. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.